The first Omega came out crying. The second refused to speak. And by midnight, even the guards were too terrified to open the Alpha King's door again. The storm above Blackthorn Palace rolled across the sky like a living creature, thick clouds swallowing the moon as freezing rain slammed against the towering windows. Deep inside the northern wing of the palace, another roar shook the stone walls hard enough to rattle the chandeliers overhead. Servants froze where they stood. Several maids lowered their eyes immediately, whispering prayers beneath trembling breaths. No one needed to ask where the sound came from. Everyone in the kingdom knew. Alpha King Lucian Duskbane was entering another heat cycle. And every time it happened, the entire palace held its breath. Rosalie Vale tightened her grip around the basket of clean linens pressed against her chest as she hurried through the servant corridor beneath the grand staircase. The scent of rainwater and candle smoke filled the air, but beneath it lingered something heavier tonight. Something wild, sharp, dangerous. Even from 3 floors below the royal chambers, she could feel it crawling against her skin. "Keep your head down," one of the older kitchen women whispered as they passed her. "And don't look toward the north wing." Rosalie nodded quickly. She never looked toward the north wing anymore. Not after the last blood moon, when an entire hallway had been sealed for 3 days after the king lost control of his wolf. Rumors traveled fast in servant quarters. Some claimed the Alpha King hadn't slept properly in over 5 years. Others whispered that no Omega could survive being near him once the heat began. Rosalie didn't know which stories were true. She only knew the sound of his voice carried through stone walls like thunder, deep enough to make her heartbeat stumble every single time. Another roar echoed through the palace. This one closer. The lanterns above flickered violently. Rosalie nearly dropped the basket. Around her, servants immediately scattered in silence, disappearing into side corridors like frightened ghosts. A royal guard sprinted past seconds later, his face pale beneath his silver armor. "Move," he barked. "Nobody stays in this corridor." Rosalie stepped backward instinctively. Her shoulder hit the cold stone wall behind her. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Fast. A second group of guards rushed around the corner carrying chains made from polished silver links nearly 2 inches thick. One of them muttered under his breath. He broke the first restraints already. Rosalie's stomach tightened painfully. Heat cycles among wolves were private. Sacred, even. But the Alpha King's condition had become something else entirely. Something people feared speaking about after dark. She lowered her head and hurried the opposite direction, desperate to return to the kitchens before anyone noticed she was still wandering the upper halls. But as thunder exploded overhead, the palace lights suddenly dimmed. The entire corridor fell into darkness for half a second. Then came a violent crash from somewhere above. Screaming followed. Rosalie flinched hard enough to stumble sideways. Her basket slipped from her hands, linen scattering across the floor. "No, no," she whispered, dropping to her knees to gather them quickly. That was when she realized the hallway around her had gone completely silent. Too silent. Slowly, Rosalie looked up. Every servant was gone. Every guard. Every light except one. At the far end of the corridor, a single iron door stood partially open. Warm golden light spilled across the floor beneath it, flickering softly against the darkness. The north wing. Rosalie's breathing stopped. She recognized the carved wolf insignia burned into the black steel immediately. The Alpha King's chambers. Her pulse hammered violently in her ears. The door should not have been open. It was never open. Somewhere inside, she heard heavy breathing. Not angry. Not violent. Exhausted. Like something enormous struggling simply to remain standing. Rosalie rose slowly from the floor before she could stop herself. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But another sound reached her then. A low, rough exhale filled with pain so deep it tightened something painfully inside her chest. She took one hesitant step forward. Then another. The scent hit her. Immediately. Pine smoke. Winter air. Rain against cold stone. Powerful enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Rosalie gripped the edge of the doorway carefully, peering into the chamber. Candlelight danced across massive stone walls lined with broken chains and overturned furniture. Deep claw marks stretched across the floor like scars, and at the center of the room stood the Alpha King himself. Lucian Duskbane towered near the shattered balcony doors, broad shoulders rising and falling beneath a black shirt torn open at the collar. His dark hair hung loose and damp around his face. One silver restraint still circled his wrist, the broken chain dragging across the marble floor beside him. Even from several feet away, Rosalie could feel the pressure of his presence pressing against her chest. Dangerous, ancient, unbearably powerful. But it wasn't his size that froze her in place. It was the look in his eyes. Silver, bright, exhausted beyond words. As if the monster everyone feared was simply tired of fighting himself. Another gust of wind swept rain into the chamber. Lucien's head turned sharply toward the doorway. Toward her. Rosalie's breath caught instantly. For one terrifying second, neither of them moved. Then the Alpha King inhaled slowly, and everything in the room went still. The Alpha King's silver eyes locked onto Rosalie like he had forgotten how to breathe. The storm outside continued to roar against the palace walls, but inside the chamber, every sound seemed to disappear beneath the crushing weight of his attention. Rosalie stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers trembling against the iron frame as cold rain drifted through the shattered balcony behind him. Lucien Duskbane inhaled once more, slower this time, as if testing the air itself. The sharp tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Not completely, just enough for her to notice. A strange silence spread through the room. Rosalie had spent most of her life avoiding attention. In Blackthorn Palace, servants like her learned quickly that invisibility was survival. But standing there beneath the candlelight, with the Alpha King staring at her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth, she had never felt more visible in her entire life. "You should not be here," Lucien said finally. His voice was rough, low enough to vibrate through the room like distant thunder. Rosalie swallowed hard. "I am sorry, Your Majesty." She lowered her eyes immediately. The corridor guards disappeared after the power surge. "I got lost." Another gust of freezing wind swept through the chamber. The candles flickered violently again. Somewhere behind Lucien, one of the silver chains scraped softly across the marble floor as he shifted his weight. Rosalie dared a glance upward. Up close, he looked even more exhausted than the rumors claimed. Shadows darkened the skin beneath his eyes. His breathing remained uneven, like he was constantly fighting against something inside himself. Yet despite the terrifying power radiating from him, there was another emotion hidden beneath it now. Relief. The realization unsettled her more than fear. Lucien's gaze drifted briefly toward the open doorway behind her, then back to her face. "Leave," he said quietly. Rosalie nodded too quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty." She bent to gather the last fallen linen near the doorway, desperate to escape before his control vanished again. But the moment she stepped backward, Lucien's expression changed sharply. His jaw tightened. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier. Rosalie stopped moving immediately. A low sound escaped his throat, not angry exactly. Pained. His fingers curled slightly at his side, as though resisting an instinct he did not trust. Confusion flickered across his face. Then frustration. "Wait." The single word halted her completely. Rosalie looked back carefully. Lucien had not moved from his place near the balcony, but the silver restraint around his wrist trembled faintly from the force in his grip. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling again. "Why does your scent calm the room?" Rosalie blinked in confusion. "My scent." He opened his eyes slowly. The silver in them no longer looked wild. It looked focused entirely on her. "Every omega they brought here made the heat worse," he said. "The moment they entered this chamber, my wolf fought harder." His voice lowered. "But you." Rosalie's pulse stumbled painfully. No one had ever spoken about her scent before. Most omegas carried floral or sweet fragrances once they came of age. Hers had always been faint, barely noticeable. One of the reasons the other servant girls mocked her so often. Lucien took a slow step forward. The chain dragged across the floor behind him with a soft metallic sound. Rosalie instinctively stepped back again, her heart racing. Immediately, pain crossed his expression so suddenly that she froze in place. Another deep breath left him. The tension in his body eased once more. Like her presence alone quieted something dangerous inside him. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Rain tapped softly against the shattered balcony windows while candlelight danced across the massive room. Then footsteps suddenly echoed outside the chamber. Fast, panicked. Voices followed moments later. "Your Majesty?" One of the guards called carefully from beyond the hallway. "Are you alive in there?" Lucien never looked away from Rosalie. "Yes," he answered calmly. The guard fell silent immediately, clearly stunned by the steadiness in the king's voice. Because for the first time in months, The monster inside Blackthorn Palace no longer sounded out of control. The news spread through Blackthorn Palace before sunrise. Servants whispered it behind trembling hands while guards exchanged uneasy looks in silent corridors. The Alpha King had gone an entire hour without destroying another room. For the first time in months, the northern wing had fallen quiet. Rosalie sat stiffly in a velvet chair near the chamber fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap as golden flames crackled softly nearby. She had not been allowed to leave. Not after the royal physician arrived moments after the guards heard Lucien's calm voice through the door. 3 healers now stood near the far wall pretending not to stare at her. Every few seconds, one of them glanced toward the king with visible confusion. Lucien remained near the balcony windows, tall and motionless beneath the dim candlelight. The silver restraint still circled his wrist, but his breathing had steadied completely. Outside, rain continued to pour across the kingdom in silver sheets beneath the dark sky. This should not be possible, one of the older healers murmured quietly. The heat usually worsens by midnight. Another healer lowered his voice further. His pulse has normalized. Rosalie wished they would stop talking about him like he was not standing 10 feet away. The tension in the room felt strange now. Less violent. More fragile. Like everyone feared speaking too loudly would break whatever impossible thing had happened tonight. Lucien's gaze shifted toward her again. Every single time he looked at her, Rosalie felt it low in her chest. Not fear exactly. Awareness. As though some invisible thread had appeared between them without her permission. "What is your name?" he asked suddenly. The room went silent again. Rosalie swallowed carefully. "Rosalie Vale, Your Majesty." His silver eyes narrowed slightly, as if committing the sound of it to memory. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. "And no one noticed your scent before tonight?" Embarrassment warmed her face immediately. One of the younger healers answered before she could. "Most believed she barely carried one at all, Your Majesty." Rosalie lowered her eyes quickly after that. She knew how the others saw her. Forgettable. Plain. A servant Omega with weak instincts and almost no presence. In palace hierarchy, girls like her disappeared into the background, while beautiful court Omegas drew attention like sunlight. But Lucien continued staring at her with unsettling focus. "They were wrong," he said quietly. Something shifted in the room after those words. The older healer exchanged a glance with the others. One of the guards near the doorway straightened slightly, his expression uncertain. Rosalie herself did not understand why her pulse suddenly felt unsteady. Lucien moved closer to the fireplace at last. Slow. Controlled. Every movement carried the heavy grace of something powerful forcing itself into restraint. He stopped several feet away from her chair, close enough for her to catch the clean scent of winter pine drifting from his skin beneath the storm air. "Look at me," he said softly. Rosalie hesitated, before lifting her eyes. The moment she did, Lucien inhaled again. His expression changed instantly. Not pain this time. Relief. Deep enough to soften the hard lines of his face for a single brief moment. The room noticed it too. One healer nearly dropped the glass vial in his hand. Lucien closed his eyes slowly. "For the first time in years," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. The noise stopped. Rosalie's chest tightened unexpectedly. She did not know why those words hurt to hear. Perhaps because beneath all the terrifying stories and whispered rumors, the Alpha King suddenly sounded less like a monster and more like a man who had been drowning for a very long time. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. The chamber doors opened immediately afterward. Lord Victor Ashbourne, head of the Royal Council, stepped inside wearing a dark military coat lined with silver trim. His cold gray eyes landed on Rosalie instantly. Disapproval crossed his face without hesitation. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the Council requests an immediate update regarding your condition." Lucien never looked away from Rosalie. "My condition is stable." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Because of her, the room fell still once more. Rosalie instinctively gripped the fabric of her dress tighter. She did not miss the suspicion in the councilman's voice. Lucien finally turned his head toward him. The warmth vanished from his expression immediately. "Yes," the Alpha King answered calmly. "Because of her." By sunrise, every servant in Blackthorn Palace knew the Alpha King had refused to let the Omega Girl leave his chambers. Rosalie felt the weight of those whispers everywhere. They followed her through the long marble hallways, through the servant kitchens, even into the quiet corners of the palace garden where she usually escaped when work became too overwhelming. The stares were worse than the whispers. Confused, jealous, afraid. Rosalie kept her head lowered as she carried a tray of herbal tea through the east corridor later that afternoon. She had slept barely an hour after finally being escorted from the northern wing at dawn. But exhaustion could not quiet the strange feeling, still lingering beneath her skin. The memory of Lucien's silver eyes refusing to leave her face haunted her with unsettling clarity. So it is true. Rosalie froze. 3 palace omegas stood near the archway ahead, dressed in elegant pale gowns meant for court gatherings. Beautiful, refined, everything Rosalie was not. The tallest among them crossed her arms slowly. The servant girl spent the entire night beside the king. Another omega scoffed softly. Impossible. His heat nearly sent Lady Miranda home crying last winter, and she was bred from one of the strongest bloodlines in the kingdom. Rosalie tightened her grip on the tea tray. I was only helping the healers. Helping. The tall omega stepped closer. Her perfume filled the air with overpowering sweetness. You expect us to believe a kitchen servant succeeded where royal omegas failed. Rosalie opened her mouth carefully. I did not ask for any of this. No, the woman replied coldly. But clearly the king asked for you. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut. Rosalie lowered her eyes again, hoping they would leave. Instead, one of the omegas leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful. Men like Lucien Duskbane do not become obsessed without destroying something in the process." The words settled heavily in Rosalie's chest long after they walked away. She tried convincing herself they meant nothing. But deep down, fear had already begun spreading quietly through her thoughts. Because part of her knew they were right. None of this made sense. She was nobody. A servant omega with weak instincts and a nearly invisible scent. Yet somehow the Alpha King of Blackthorn Palace had looked at her like he could finally breathe again. The thought alone terrified her. Rosalie resumed walking quickly through the corridor until she reached the royal library doors. A guard immediately straightened at her approach. "Miss Vale," he said carefully. "His Majesty requests your presence." Her heartbeat stumbled. "Now." The guard nodded once. Rosalie glanced toward the silver tray trembling faintly in her hands. "I still have duties downstairs," His Majesty insisted. Those 3 words changed everything inside the palace now. No servant argued after hearing them. Rosalie swallowed hard before following the guard through the upper corridors once more. Outside the tall windows, storm clouds still darkened the kingdom despite the late afternoon hour. Rainwater rolled down the glass, while distant thunder echoed beyond the mountains surrounding Blackthorn. The palace itself felt quieter today. Watching, waiting. When they reached the northern wing, Rosalie immediately noticed the guards standing outside Lucien's chambers no longer looked terrified. Uneasy, yes, but not afraid. One of them even opened the chamber doors without hesitation this time. Warm firelight spilled across the floor. Lucien stood near the massive stone fireplace wearing a dark charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. The silver restraint was gone now. He turned the moment Rosalie entered. The instant his eyes found her, the tension in his expression eased visibly. Rosalie stopped breathing for half a second. Because he looked relieved. Again, the chamber doors closed softly behind her. Lucien studied her quietly before speaking. "You left." Rosalie blinked in surprise. "Your Majesty, it has been almost 8 hours." "I know." His voice lowered slightly. "The heat returned the moment you did." A cold shiver moved down her spine. Lucien stepped closer slowly, his gaze fixed entirely on her face. "Come here, Rosalie." The way he said her name no longer sounded like a command. It sounded like something far more dangerous. "Need." Rosalie's feet refused to move at first. The fire crackled softly between them while rain whispered against the towering windows beyond the balcony. Lucien stood only a few feet away now, close enough for her to notice the exhaustion hidden beneath the sharp angles of his face. The terrifying tension from the night before had faded, but something deeper had taken its place. Something quieter, more dangerous. The Alpha King watched her like a starving man finally seeing water after years in the desert. Rosalie forced herself to step closer anyway. The moment the distance between them disappeared, Lucien released a slow breath that sounded almost painful. His shoulders lowered slightly. Relief again. Always relief when she was near him. Rosalie could not understand it. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly before she could stop herself. Lucien's eyes lifted toward hers immediately. What? The heat. Silence stretched between them for several seconds. Most people in the palace avoided speaking about his condition directly. But Rosalie had spent the entire night watching the exhaustion in his eyes, watching him fight for control every second he breathed. Lucien finally looked toward the fire. It feels like noise that never ends, he admitted quietly. Like my wolf is trapped beneath my skin, trying to tear its way free. His voice lowered further. Until you walk into the room. Rosalie's heartbeat quickened painfully. No one had ever looked at her the way Lucien did now. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was important, but because somehow she brought him peace. The realization frightened her more with every passing minute. A knock sounded at the chamber doors. Lucien's expression hardened instantly. Enter. The royal healer stepped inside, carrying several ancient scrolls bound in dark leather. Elder Miriam looked nearly 70, with silver hair braided tightly against the back of her head and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Unlike the others, she did not stare at Rosalie with jealousy or suspicion. She studied her with curiosity. Your Majesty, Miriam said carefully, I found something in the old archives. Lucien remained standing beside Rosalie as the healer approached the large oak table near the fireplace. She unrolled one of the scrolls slowly. Symbols drawn in faded silver ink stretched across the ancient parchment. Rosalie did not recognize the language. Miriam pointed toward a crescent-shaped mark painted near the center. This symbol appears in records over 400 years old, she explained quietly. It describes a rare lunar bond between an Alpha King and a moon-touched Omega. Lucien's eyes narrowed slightly. Moon-touched. Miriam looked directly at Rosalie. An Omega whose presence naturally calms unstable wolf instincts. Extremely rare. Most bloodlines vanished generations ago. Rosalie stared at the old parchment in confusion. That cannot be me. Can it not? Miriam asked gently. Rosalie shook her head immediately. I am nobody. I grew up in the servant district outside the Eastern Market. My mother died when I was young. There is nothing special about me. But even as she spoke, uncertainty crept into her chest. Because deep down, she remembered strange moments throughout her life. Nervous horses calming near her touch. Angry wolves lowering their heads around her without explanation. A strange warmth people sometimes mentioned when she entered a room. Small things she had always ignored. Lucien stepped closer beside her. Look at me. Rosalie obeyed before realizing she had done so automatically. His silver eyes searched her face carefully. The moment you leave, he said quietly, the heat returns. Miriam lowered her voice. Your Majesty, if this truly is a moon bond, then what? Lucien asked without looking away from Rosalie. The old healer hesitated. Then separating from her may become impossible. The fire snapped sharply inside the silence that followed. Rosalie's breath caught instantly. Impossible. The word echoed painfully inside her chest. Lucien remained perfectly still beside her, but something unreadable darkened his expression. Then, very slowly, his hand lifted toward her face. He stopped just before touching her cheek, like he feared the contact itself. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Rosalie. The way he said her name no longer sounded uncertain. It sounded inevitable. The rain finally stopped 3 days later, but Blackthorn Palace remained wrapped in tension thick enough to feel beneath the skin. Rosalie noticed it everywhere now. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Servants lowered their eyes too quickly. Even the guards outside the northern wing watched her differently, as if the quiet Omega carrying tea through palace corridors had suddenly become something dangerous. Because every person inside those walls knew one thing by now. The Alpha King could not rest without her. Rosalie stood near the palace greenhouse that evening, her fingers brushing softly against the damp petals of white moon. Lilies glowing beneath hanging lanterns. This had always been the only peaceful place inside the palace. Warm glass ceilings. The scent of wet earth and flowers. Silence untouched by royal politics. But even here, her thoughts would not leave her alone. Impossible to separate. Elder Miriam's words had echoed inside her mind for days. Rosalie exhaled slowly, staring at her faint reflection in the greenhouse glass. She still looked the same. Pale skin, soft brown hair pinned loosely behind her shoulders. Plain gray servant dress. Nothing about her resembled the powerful women standing beside kings in royal paintings. Yet somehow Lucien looked at her like she belonged beside him already. Footsteps sounded softly behind her. Rosalie turned instantly. Lucien stood near the greenhouse entrance wearing a dark coat over black formal clothing, rainwater still clinging faintly to the silver strands of his hair. He must have crossed half the palace searching for her again. The realization sent warmth and panic through her chest at the same time. His expression eased the moment he saw her. "There you are," he said quietly. Rosalie lowered her eyes immediately. "Your Majesty should not be walking the palace alone during recovery." Lucien moved closer through the lantern glow. "And yet my recovery worsens every time you disappear." The honesty in his voice unsettled her every single time. He never tried hiding it anymore. The need, the dependence, the strange calm he found only near her. Rosalie looked away toward the flowers again. "This is dangerous." Silence followed. Then Lucien stepped beside her near the moon lilies, close enough that warmth drifted from him through the cool evening air. "You are afraid of me." "No," Rosalie answered too quickly. Because that was the problem. She was not afraid enough. Lucien studied her carefully. "Then what frightens you?" Rosalie's fingers tightened around the edge of the stone planter. Outside the greenhouse windows, thunder rumbled faintly beyond distant mountains. "I do not know what this bond is turning into," she admitted softly. "The entire palace watches me now like I have done something wrong." Lucien's jaw tightened. Slightly. "You have done nothing wrong." "But what if this is only your heat?" she whispered. "What if once it ends?" Her voice faltered painfully. Lucien turned toward her fully then. "Look at me, Rosalie." She did. The intensity in his silver eyes stole the breath from her lungs instantly. "I have lived with this curse for years," he said quietly. "I know the difference between instinct and peace." His gaze softened slightly. "You are the only peaceful thing I have touched in a very long time." Rosalie's heartbeat trembled so hard she feared he could hear it. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty before. No games. No cruelty. No pity. Just truth. Lucien slowly lifted one hand toward her again, giving her enough time to pull away if she wished. But Rosalie remained still as his fingertips lightly brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. The touch was impossibly gentle for someone the kingdom feared as a monster. Lucien exhaled softly, almost like the contact itself steadied him. Then suddenly the greenhouse doors burst open behind them. "Your Majesty!" A palace guard rushed inside, visibly shaken. Lucien stepped back immediately, his expression hardening once more into the cold mask of a king. "What happened?" The guard swallowed hard. "Lord Ashbourne has called an emergency council meeting." His eyes flickered nervously toward Rosalie. "The nobles are demanding the Omega girl be removed from the palace immediately." The council chamber exploded into arguments long before Lucien arrived. Noble families crowded around the massive black oak table beneath towering stained glass windows, while servants hurried nervously along the walls refilling untouched cups of tea. Rain clouds still darkened the evening sky outside, casting the room in cold silver light. Rosalie stood quietly near the entrance beside Elder Miriam, trying to make herself invisible again. It did not work anymore. Every eye in the chamber found her eventually, some filled with suspicion, others with disgust, a few with fear. Lord Victor Ashbourne stood at the center of the room in his dark formal coat, one hand pressed firmly against the council table. "This situation has already spread beyond palace walls," he declared sharply. "The kingdom whispers that an unnamed servant Omega now controls the Alpha King himself." Rosalie's stomach tightened painfully. Miriam stepped slightly closer beside her, almost protective. "The girl has done nothing except help stabilize His Majesty." Victor's expression hardened. "Exactly the problem." Several nobles nodded immediately. One elderly woman seated near the far side of the table lifted her jeweled cane. "No unknown Omega should possess this level of influence over the throne." "Influence?" Miriam replied coldly. "She kept your king alive. Or enchanted him." Another councilman snapped. Rosalie lowered her eyes immediately as the room erupted into overlapping voices again. Witchcraft. Manipulation. Moon curse. Dangerous bloodline. The accusation struck harder than she expected. She had spent her entire life unnoticed. Invisible. Yet now powerful nobles spoke about her like she had become some threat to the kingdom simply by existing near Lucien. The chamber doors suddenly opened behind them. Silence crashed through the room instantly. Lucien Duskbane entered wearing a long black coat lined with silver embroidery, his dark hair still slightly damp from the storm outside. The atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped forward. Every noble lowered their voice immediately. Some even lowered their eyes. Power rolled from him naturally, heavy enough to silence the entire chamber without effort. But Rosalie noticed something else first. The moment Lucien's gaze landed on her, the sharp tension in his expression eased. Relief again. Always relief. Victor noticed it too. His jaw tightened visibly. "Your Majesty," he began carefully. "We are discussing the matter of the Omega." Lucien walked toward the council table slowly, his silver eyes never leaving Rosalie for more than a second at a time. "Then discuss it in front of her," he said calmly. "Not around her." The nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Victor straightened. "Very well. The council believes Miss Vale should be relocated outside palace grounds until we better understand this attachment." Rosalie felt the air leave her lungs. Lucien stopped, walking completely. The room grew colder somehow. "Attachment," he repeated quietly. Victor continued carefully despite the warning hidden beneath the king's voice. "The kingdom cannot risk instability around the throne. If her presence affects your judgment, my judgment has improved for the first time in years," Lucien interrupted sharply. Silence followed instantly. Victor's face hardened. "And if this bond weakens you emotionally?" Lucien's silver eyes darkened. "You mistake calmness for weakness." The pressure in the chamber became almost unbearable. Rosalie could feel it pressing against her chest while thunder rolled faintly outside the palace walls. Then one of the younger nobles spoke nervously from the far side of the table. "People already believe she is controlling the heat somehow." Another voice followed. "Some servants claim the king cannot even sleep unless she remains nearby." Lucien did not deny it. That frightened the room more than anger would have. Victor took a slow breath before delivering the final blow. "Your Majesty, if this continues, the council may be forced to act for the protection of the crown." The meaning behind those words settled into the chamber like poison. Rosalie felt cold instantly, because for the first time since all of this began, she realized the danger was no longer the heat itself. It was what people would do to separate them. Lucien slowly turned toward Victor. His expression remained calm. Too calm. "Try," he said softly. The single word sent silence crashing across the entire room. Then Lucien crossed the chamber directly toward Rosalie, without waiting for permission from anyone. He stopped beside her, close enough for warmth to reach her skin through the cold air. Every noble in the room watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King lowered his voice and said only to her, "You are staying with me tonight." That night, Blackthorn Palace felt less like a royal home and more like a kingdom preparing for war. Guards doubled along every corridor leading toward the northern wing, while servants whispered nervously behind closed doors. No one trusted the silence after the council meeting, least of all Rosalie. She stood near the tall bedroom windows inside Lucien's chambers, watching lightning flicker across distant mountains beyond the rain-covered glass. The storm had returned shortly after midnight, wrapping the palace in cold silver light once more. Behind her, the fire burned low inside the massive stone hearth. Lucien sat in a chair nearby, one arm resting against the carved wood beside him, his silver eyes fixed quietly on her like he feared she might disappear if he looked away too long. Neither of them had spoken much since returning from the council chamber, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt heavy with things neither of them fully understood yet. Rosalie finally turned from the window. "They are afraid of me now." Lucien's expression darkened slightly. "They are afraid of losing control." "And what if they are right?" she whispered. "What if this bond changes you?" Lucien held her gaze steadily. "It already has." The honesty in his voice unsettled her every time. Rosalie lowered her eyes, trying to quiet the storm building inside her chest. She should have been terrified. Instead, standing here beside the most feared Alpha King in the kingdom felt strangely safe. That frightened her more than anything else. A sudden knock shattered the quiet. Before either of them could answer, the chamber doors burst open hard enough to strike the wall. Elder Miriam hurried inside, breathing unevenly beneath her dark cloak. "Your Majesty," she said urgently, "there is no time." Lucien stood immediately. "What happened?" Miriam glanced toward Rosalie with visible concern. The council moved faster than expected. Lord Ashbourne has already ordered several guards loyal to him to remove Miss Vale from the palace before dawn. Rosalie's blood ran cold. "What?" "He claims it is temporary," Miriam continued sharply. "But if they take you beyond palace grounds tonight, separating you from His Majesty during the bond formation could permanently damage both of you." Lucien's expression turned deadly calm. Where are they? Already moving through the eastern corridors. The room fell silent for one dangerous second. Then Lucien crossed the chamber toward Rosalie. Immediately. Stay beside me. The command carried enough force to still the air itself. Rosalie's heartbeat pounded violently as distant footsteps suddenly echoed somewhere beyond the hallway outside. Fast. Organized. Coming closer. Lucien positioned himself slightly in front of her without hesitation. Protective. The realization hit Rosalie so hard it almost hurt. Another loud knock shook the doors. Your Majesty, a voice called from outside. By order of the Royal Council, the Omega Girl is to be escorted from the palace for questioning. Lucien's silver eyes never left the doors. Denied. Silence followed briefly. Then the voice returned, tighter this time. The order carries the authority of the crown. Lucien's jaw tightened. I am the crown. Rosalie had never heard a room fall silent so completely before. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment. Then another voice spoke from beyond the doors. Victor Ashbourne himself. Lucien, he said carefully, you are no longer thinking clearly. The use of his first name alone made Elder Miriam stiffen instantly. Lucien's expression became unreadable, cold enough to freeze the air around him. You entered my chambers, he said softly, to threaten someone under my protection. Rosalie felt the shift immediately. The pressure in the room deepened like thunder before a storm breaks open. She could almost feel the wolf beneath Lucien's skin stirring restlessly again. But then something impossible happened. Lucien reached backward without looking and found her hand beside him. The instant their fingers touched, the tension around him eased slightly. Not gone. Controlled. Every person outside those doors noticed it too. Silence spread through the corridor beyond the chamber. Because for the first time, the entire palace witnessed the truth. The only thing capable of calming the Alpha King was her. No one slept inside Blackthorn Palace that night. The storm raged until dawn, shaking the ancient towers with thunder while guards remained frozen outside the northern wing, too afraid to force the chamber doors open again. Inside, silence settled slowly over the room after Victor Ashbourne and the council finally retreated. Rosalie sat beside the fire wrapped in a heavy wool blanket one of the servants had quietly delivered hours earlier. Across from her, Lucien remained awake near the balcony windows, watching the dark horizon beyond the rain. But for the first time since she had met him, the restless tension beneath his skin had disappeared completely. The heat was gone. Elder Miriam noticed it before anyone else. When she returned shortly after sunrise carrying fresh medical herbs, she stopped walking the moment she entered the chamber. Her sharp blue eyes moved immediately toward Lucien. Your pulse, she whispered softly. Lucien looked down at his own hands almost like he did not recognize the stillness inside himself either. No shaking, no strain, no desperate restraint barely holding a monster back. Just calm, real calm. Miriam slowly smiled for the first time in days. The bond stabilized him. Rosalie's chest tightened. She looked toward Lucien carefully. He was already watching her. That look again. Deep, steady, certain. Like every answer he had searched for his entire life was somehow sitting beside the fireplace, wearing a simple servant dress. Word spread through the palace within hours. The Alpha King had slept peacefully through the entire night. No shattered walls. No broken restraints. No terrifying roars echoing through the kingdom. By noon, nobles flooded the palace requesting confirmation. By evening, rumors had already crossed beyond Blackthorn's gates into nearby territories. Some called it a miracle. Others called it dangerous. But no one called Rosalie invisible anymore. The grand hall filled before sunset under orders from the crown. Hundreds of nobles gathered beneath towering chandeliers, while servants lined the marble walls whispering nervously among themselves. Rosalie stood near the bottom of the royal staircase wearing a dark silver gown Elder Miriam had insisted she borrow for the evening. Her hands trembled softly against the fabric. She had never stood inside the grand hall unless she was serving food. Now every eye in the kingdom seemed fixed directly on her. Breathe, Miriam whispered gently beside her. Rosalie tried. Trumpets suddenly echoed through the hall. The massive throne room doors opened. Silence crashed across the crowd instantly as Lucien Duskbane entered wearing formal black royal attire lined with silver embroidery across his shoulders. Powerful, elegant, terrifying. Yet the moment his eyes found Rosalie standing near the staircase, something softer appeared in his expression. The nobles noticed that too. Lucien crossed the hall slowly beneath hundreds of stunned stares. He did not stop at the throne. He walked directly toward her instead. Rosalie's heartbeat pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Lucien stopped only inches away. Then, before the entire kingdom, the Alpha King lowered himself onto one knee in front of the servant Omega everyone once ignored. Gasps spread across the hall instantly. Several nobles looked completely horrified. But Lucien never looked away from Rosalie. For years, he said quietly enough that the entire silent hall still heard every word. This kingdom feared the wolf inside me. His silver eyes softened, but she never did. Rosalie felt tears burn painfully behind her eyes. Lucien reached for her trembling hand carefully, like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched. Rosalie Vale brought peace where no healer, warrior, or noble bloodline could. His voice deepened slightly. And from this day forward, no one in this kingdom will ever question her place beside me again. The entire hall stood frozen as Lucien rose slowly to his feet. Then he lifted Rosalie's hand to his chest directly above his heartbeat. She is mine, he said calmly. And I am hers. No one argued. No one moved. Because for the first time in years, the monster they feared no longer looked cursed. Standing beside Rosalie beneath the palace lights, Lucien Duskbane finally looked human again.